I'm very pleased to welcome you to this third session of our seminar, which is co-organized, I recall, by our colleagues from OVD-Info and by several researchers from Sciences Po and CERCEC in EHESS. The first two sessions of the seminar were devoted to the history of OVD-Info and how its founder had gradually organized this multifaceted project, which is all-in-one an information project, judicial assistance project, and documentation and analytical project. And of course, in this seminar, we are more focusing on this last part, which is documenting and analyzing the political repression in Russia. In the second seminar, we turned our attention to the documentation and analysis of political repression between 2012, the year of the foundation of the organization, and February 22, and the start of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine. The data analyzed already highlighted the systematization of many cases of repression, reflected among all other in an increase in the number of political prisoners. Today, we are going to take a thorough look at political repression since February-March 2022. As you all know, of course, political repression has intensified considerably, both in terms of the legislation itself and in the use of the existing provision of existing legislation, which have been also all considerably extended. Alongside with well-known personalities who have been arrested and sentenced to heavy penalties, such as Vladimir Kara-Murza, maybe the most known, with 25 years, or Ilya Yashin with 7 years, or who are at risk of a real sentence, such as human rights defender Oleg Orlov just now. We must also mention, of course, the thousands of anonymous people who all over the territory of Russian Federation have been convicted or are awaiting trial or are facing a risk of judicial procedure. After trying to take to the streets in the early days of the repression, many people have turned to more discreet forms of action, such as laying flowers in front of monuments to Ukraine after bombings, giving their opinion on social network, saying something in a classroom, whether as a pupil or a teacher, with the risk of being denounced. So today, we could sum up the situation as follows. Of course, if not everyone is systematically arrested, charged, or convicted, neither is anyone entirely safe when it comes to expressing an opinion critical, which is criticizing either the war in Ukraine, either the regime. So, as citizens and as researchers, the situation, of course, calls out to us. And of course, it makes it all the more important to have detailed and reliable data if we want to understand what this repression tells us about the evolution of the regime and about the state of the civil societies and its possibilities for action. Just before giving the floor to Daniel and the other colleagues of OVD-Info, I would like to stress that the recent appearance, and it's a good news, of OVD-Info in the French media, with an article of Régis Janté in Le Figaro, with a report by Isabelle Mandron in Le Monde, with also a lot of data from OVD-Info, and just yesterday night, a special edition of Esprit de Justice, a regular program in France Culture at 9 p.m. that you can, of course, listen in replay, and which was devoted to the fate of political prisoners in Russia, based on the reading of letters of these political prisoners. So please, Daniel and colleagues, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anne. And my name is Daniel Bellinson. I'm co-founder of OVD-Info. Today, we also have seven brilliant of my colleagues, and we are sitting in a very strange auditorium. Usually, we have much less space. Our conversation today I will share the presentation now, sorry. Yes. Our presentation, our conversation today is dedicated to repression after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we will give an overview of different persecutions. We will discuss the problems that arise in collecting information on repression. But as we discussed during the first seminar, OVD-Info is also the organization which is working a lot providing legal assistance to persecuted people. So we thought that this part of our work should be also covered today. And I'm very glad that my colleagues agreed to speak about defense of persecuted in a repressive environment and about our strategic litigation. So our agenda is very tightly packed today for such a big topic. So I invite you to download a presentation which we'll send you after the seminar and explore it in more detail. We will go through a lot of slides very quickly. Before we will start discussing the current situation with criminal repression, let me very shortly remind you the discussion we had during last seminar about different types of repression. What we call criminal political persecution is only the small part of a much more complex landscape of repression. And speaking about contemporary repression, we should understand that they also include practices of massive persecutions under administrative law and other extrajudicial practices oriented towards the effect of intimidation of society. So today, almost 1,000 people are imprisoned in Russia on political grounds. Almost the same amount are under investigation. The authorities use a very broad set of allegations. So we counted 190 articles of criminal code in use in persecution of this people. Speaking of those who are now imprisoned, the vast majority of them are men, 94 persons, as you see. More than a half are between the ages of 31 and 50. Almost half are in colonies. Around 40 persons are imprisoned before trial.
Заедем в магазин?
Sorry.
Завтра праздник у нас.
Can I ask you to mute the microphone because
День свадьбы нашей.
from someone very talk. Yes, thank you very much. So 12 people are forced to remain in medical institutions of different types, psychiatric hospitals, 7, correctional treatment facilities, 3 persons, and medical correctional institutions, 2 persons. We don't know, we don't know the location of all people, but we have information about most of them. And we know that they are spread at least across 72 regions, including the annexed territories of Ukraine. 20% of people who are under investigation are women. However, only 7% of them are in custody. In general, placement in custody is the most used pretrial measure against men, whereas most of the women receive the measure of travel restriction. Looking at the frequency of arrests in the regions, we can see that there are a few regions which are using this restraint measure more often than arrests, but they are in absolute minority. On the map, you can see the location of these regions. Speaking about sentences, real deprivation of liberty is the most widespread outcome of the trials, following suspended terms and fines. Looking from gender perspective, the suspended terms are more used. Deprivation of liberty is most widespread among all age groups, except those who are over 70. But even there are 2 people who serve in real terms. most of the men receive 4 to 15 years terms, whereas women receive 4 to 10 years and never more, at least until a certain moment. Although the common regime of penal colony appears in the majority of sentences, a third of imprisoned men were sentenced to strict regime colony. As you might see in this table, the regime of colony and length of prison term mostly related to the gravity of their alleged offense. These are the people who were charged with terrorism and or seizure of power. Speaking about fines, there are 155 sentences with this type of punishment, sometimes in addition to the others. Most common fine amount between 1,000 and 3,000 euros. However, women are more likely to be sentenced to a higher fine. If we look at the same data disaggregated by the article of the Criminal Code, we will see that for the certain articles, fines are more common in the age group between 51 and 70 ages, including for the so-called fake news, for which the fine could reach up to 50,000 euros. We can also clearly see here that the proportion of women receiving fines is higher than in case of imprisonment. And speaking about dynamics, these graphs show you changes on intensity of repression. We see here a wave-like pattern. The blue squares here, it is when there's less repressions, and the gray one, there's more repressions. So it is like a wave, but during the last half of the year, repression, new cases are getting fewer, as you might see. That is, the number of repression is increasing, of course, but less rapidly compared to previous periods. On the following slides, you will see the same picture. The dynamics, this is the dynamics disaggregated by the gender and the age group, and I will now be more faster, but you will be able later, when we will share the presentation, to look closely into that. This is the dynamics of preventive measures before the trial. The sharp decline in recent months can also be attributed to the fact that we often learn about prosecution later than it started. There are dynamics of type of verdicts, the dynamics of imprisonments, of terms of imprisonment. In terms of punishment, the median of imprisonment terms stays more or less the same, whereas fluctuations in the use of penalties are much more evident. Now, I would like to give a floor to my colleague Gregory Dunnawo, who will speak about anti-war repression and compare current criminal political persecution with the period before the full-scale invasion. Please, Gregory, are you here?
Yes, thank you. So here you can see some statistics concerning the politically motivated criminal proceedings in 2022 and 2023. Directly against anti-war statements, anti-war performances, or other kinds of anti-war expressions such as graffiti, taking part in anti-war rallies, and even radical actions such as arson. We gave all these criminal cases a joint code name anti-war case, although those are separate cases without any direct connection between each other. We also include here cases instigated because of some other activities not related to the war directly, but we have reason to believe that the main pretext for the persecution was really related with some anti-war activities. There are also some borderline cases that we don't show here and that my colleague will talk about a few minutes later. The number of cases, as you can see here, of cases and people persecuted is changing day to day. Now it exceeds 800. You can see quite a significant amount of cases that entail deprivation of freedom. But here as well, the statistics show that there were more cases instigated in a whole in 2022 than in 2023. In fact, it's all known that there was a big splash of protests in the very first days of the invasion, which made the authorities adopt new laws. And so the various expressions were punished severely and quite soon. and it made the society become more silent. However, there are some nuances. For instance, the amount of sentences is much higher in 2023, simply because part of them were in the cases instigated in 2022. We also see a bigger part of cases on Article 280.3 on discrediting the armed forces, a bigger part instigated in 2023 than in 2022. But this can be explained by the fact that a person should first face a fine under a similar administrative case, and only after that a criminal case can be instigated. The more interesting picture is with the cases on public approval of terrorism, Article 205.2. The amount in 2023 can be higher because the attacks that people speak of took place in the second half of 2022. And this also shows us perhaps the rise of radicalization in the society and in the repressions as well. Next slide, please. Here we can compare the so-called anti-war cases and other politically motivated criminal cases instigated during the same period, that is in 2022 and 2023. We still should underline that our data is changing day to day, and it's worth mentioning that it's not full. However, we still can speak about various trends. For instance, the amount of non-anti-war cases is lower, but still not very low, as you can see. And it's interesting that the rate of people imprisoned before the trial is lower in anti-war cases. Maybe this can be explained by the amount of cases on terrorism not linked to the war. I would also like to underline the amount of women that is a bit higher within the anti-war cases. Next slide, please. A very illustrative picture showing us the significant rise of the amount of cases per year and per quarter. Here we can see that the amount of cases started to rise in 2021, partly due to the protests in support of Alexei Navalny. And then it rose even more in the beginning of 2022. I have to apologize for the most intensive color in the scale there below. It appeared because of our mistake, but still I can say that the amount of this period was rather high, and later it started to decrease. Next slide, please. Here we can see the same comparison with certain numbers. Here again, I would like to underline the amount of women. First of all, imprisoned women concerning the anti-war cases, mostly the cases of so-called fake, disseminating fake information on armed forces. This rate is not much higher than in other cases, but still higher. Next slide, please. This picture needs thorough analysis and explanation that we don't have much time for, but I would like to say that here we can see that one of the most interesting results is that the amount of verdicts that don't entail the deprivation of freedom is higher than that with the deprivation of freedom, but the whole amount of both kinds of verdicts is much higher in the years 2022 and 2023 than it was before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gregory. Now, I would like to invite my colleague Elizaveta Stiglitz, who will tell us about so-called borderline cases of criminal persecutions. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you. So today I will speak about the what we call borderline cases. They were in fact mentioned by Grigory before. So since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we have encountered a growing amount of cases that do not fall under the classical peaceful protest or peaceful declaration of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of association. These are the cases that are concerned with more radical forms of protests, such as arson, mostly of draft offices, but also other administrative buildings, and sabotage, especially on the railway, subversion, such kind of acts that would not be protected by, would not fall under, persecution for such acts does not normally fall under the classical definition of political persecution, but we still feel the obligation to document them because they are usually a part of, they are highly influenced by political context, and they are used by the perpetrators as a way of making a political statement. So we have also sometimes this method. Can we skip to the next slide, please? Yeah. So here we can speak about 4 categories of cases. The first one is person admitted that she committed such act based on her political views, mostly anti-war stance, anti-mobilization stance, general despise for the current government. Also, there is the second type of the cases is if the person is an activist or a person known to the authorities as a person with an active political position, also holding anti-war, anti-government, anti-mobilization views quite openly, who is accused of such act, and we believe that there is significant evidence to believe that most of these cases are fabricated by security services. Third category is the person has admitted to committed such acts, but indicated other reason behind committing it, such as monetary reward. A lot of people are getting calls from pranksters or security services agents who are convincing them to participate in such an act and then arrest them and then push their bureaucracy numbers up. And the fourth category of the cases are the cases where no sufficient information can be obtained about a concrete person or a concrete case. Next slide, please. Why have we decided that it's important? I've talked about this before. So it's the rising amount of such cases is influenced by the political context of the full-scale repression, by effective ban of all forms of peaceful protests due to political censorship, growing amount of repression against people who do much less radical acts, such as posting something on social media or going to peaceful rallies. So that led to a certain degree of radicalization. And the second reason we feel important to document such cases is disproportionality of punishment that's used against people accused of such acts. I'm talking about the fact that in most such cases, the damage is close to zero. Like it's so there are some cases mostly concerned with, I don't know, a broken window or burned piece of carpet in the hallway, and yet people are prosecuted on terrorism charges and they receive extremely harsh sentences. A lot of people receive more over 10 years. Next one. The problems we face, as I have said before, is lack of information about the individuals. Information often appears with significant delays. Family and lawyers can decide that it's better for them not to talk to press or human rights defenders. Motives are not always known, as I've said before about the 4 categories. We cannot always be sure about the motive of each person and whether the act actually took place. And when the motive is stated, we cannot actually be sure that it's absolutely true because Federal Security Service insists that all of such cases are committed due to desire for monetary reward or are instigated by pranksters, and they're therefore people who claim such motive are given lesser sentences, lesser punishments, so they may be interested in saying such. Next slide, please. Here we show the amount of recorded cases by late September of this year. It was collected by our colleagues from human rights organization Solidarity Zone. So you can see that most of the cases concern subversion of railways. The second place holds the arson of draft offices or other government facilities. And also take notice of intent to such arsons and other. These are the cases where no act has actually been committed, but the security services claim that that a person planned to do it. Next slide. So the motive from those who openly state and hold on to their anti-war political stance, people speak about depression, feeling hopeless. So we're talking about the start emotional state, attempts to obstruct mobilization and destroy the draft records. And the third most cited motive is expression of solidarity with other forms of protests, expression of solidarity, for example, with people who went into peaceful rallies and were detained there. And among the fraud victims, we are mostly talking about older people who are coerced to such acts through prankster telephone calls and threats or promises of financial reward. So that would be all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. As we said on the beginning, the repression is much more complicated than criminal repression. And I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Polina Kurakina, who will give the overview of persecutions under administrative law. Polina, please take the floor.
So I will make a brief overview of the prosecution and administrative law. I will focus on several articles that are most indicative and one of the most common examples of prosecution. And also I will give you some statistics with pretty numbers for your enjoyment. Now, one of the first articles that I would like to focus on is Article 20.2. Previously, it was one of the main articles under which opposition-minded people were prosecuted. This article imposes punishment for violation of rules on assemblies. What exactly it means? It means that since in Russia there is a de facto permission-based procedure for any assembly, if the government doesn't give you express permission, then every participant or organizer is automatically in violation of this specific article. And this article was very widely used previously, and especially in years 2021-2022, as you can see on the next slide. Can you give me the next slide, please? So I want to give you dynamics of the application of Article 20.2. Here you can see that while there were some spikes in years 2012, which was famously protesting, and there are huge spikes in years 2021, 2022. What it means is, firstly, there were actually big protests then, but also it means that authorities became much stricter in the application of the rules, and virtually anyone, even if they were peacefully protesting, could have been detained, and they were detained. Also, the authorities have introduced new measures of face recognition technology. That meant that many people were prosecuted even after the fact, even after they were in the rally or near it. So we can see huge spikes. And unfortunately, as you can see, by very, very sharp decline in 2023, these tremendous efforts were rewarded. And now we can say that effectively right to assembly is effectively suppressed. And the protest has to evolve in different forms, especially into online forms and other forms of expression. And you can see that on the next slide, which is one of the tailor-made instruments specifically to curtail anti-war expressions. This is a very new article on discrediting of Russian military. It can be applied for public actions that aim to discrediting of Russian army, state bodies, and volunteer army formations. But even though on the first glance it looks like an actual legal article with an actual elements that can be examined, in reality we can see that performing the peaceful functions are legally presumed. It's a legal presumption at this point. We can see that discreditation is not actually examined, and in fact we can see that people are prosecuted for the variety of actions, such as just comments, likes, reposts, just showing blank sheet of paper, placards with asterisks, drawing of peace doves, and so on. Essentially, what can be prosecuted, any statement that can be construed as anti-war in its context. Next slide, please. So far, there are 8,526 cases, and it is the freshest number I can give you. It is relevant as of today. This is the number of cases that were initiated since March 22, when the article was introduced. We can see from the next slide that now the number of the cases is steadily declining, but we can see two small peaks when major events happened. In September 2022, mobilization was declared, and there is a spike of protests there. And also there is a small spike in March 2023. There was a significant date, a year of war, and because of that, in March, we can see that those who protested in the very last days of February, they were prosecuted in March. We can only speculate why this decline happens. Either the excitement of authorities has waned off and now they just do not prosecute as much, or maybe there are less statements. Unfortunately, we cannot examine how many statements there are in comparison to how many are prosecuted, but still there is this decline. Also now it is very interesting whether there would be a spike in line of recent rise of demobilization protests by those who do not oppose the war itself, but have some statements against mobilization. But right now we do not see this spike. It would be interesting to examine it. Next slide, please. Now you can see the judgment distribution on 20.3.3. These numbers are slightly older. Those are relevant as of 8th of December. You can see that the vast majority of cases, of course, impose administrative penalty. You might see this slide and think it is not that bad. There is a considerable chunk which is not a penalty, but I would like to clarify it a little bit. The majority of other cases, they are either dismissed on procedural grounds, such as returning to investigative authority. It usually means that there is some procedural mistake, like lack of signature, or maybe the documents not dated appropriately. And decision to terminate proceedings often stems from just time limits being exceeded. So the actual cases when the person is decided not in violation of this article are extremely rare. Next slide, please. Now I would like to move to, firstly, I would like to provide you some statistics on 2022. This is different statistics, it's official, it's not the one that we ourselves collect. That is why we don't have comparable statistics for 2023 yet. But here you can see the distribution between penalties. If the penalty is imposed, in all cases but one, it was administrative fine. Mean fine is about 35,000 rubles, which is about 2.5 minimal salaries. Interestingly enough, in the first half of 2023, statistics shows us that there are 6 whole warnings and not only one. So maybe there is some warning coming. Next slide, please. Some interesting regional specifics. The absolute first is Moscow in the number of cases on discreditation, 1,000 cases. The second one, interestingly enough, is the next territory of Republic of Crimea. And if we take in isolation 2023 only, then next Republic of Crimea is a leader in the number of discreditation cases. Most likely it is because in 2022, the majority of many cases were due to assemblies and rallies, and their leaders always are Moscow and St. Petersburg. But in 2023, the majority of cases are for other expressions, such as expressions online. So that is why Crimea is the leader now. Next slide, please. Very briefly, I would like to outline you foreign agents legislation, which has significantly worsened in the last years. The restrictions were tightened. There were several additional articles that included additional restrictions. Also, the legislation was consolidated and unified. Next slide, please. So the main article here is 19.34. It introduces punishment for people who fail to declare as foreign agent, or for those who fail to report to authorities, and the violation will lead to administrative fines. Next slide, please. So there is also Article 20.33. It introduces fines for participation in undesirable organizations, and is also applicable to all Russian citizens and foreigners. Next slide, please. And the last article under this umbrella of foreign agents and undesirable organizations is 19.34.2, and it is the freshest article in this particular group, and it prohibits participation in unregistered foreign organizations which do not have subsidiary in Russia. And even though the interesting thing about this slide is that these organizations do not have to be put on a specific list, so they don't have to be formally recognized as anything. It's just participation in any foreign organization that is not registered in Russia. Administrative fine under this article is fairly small, up to 5,000 rubles, but it holds additional risks, which I will talk to you about later. Next slide, please. So currently there are 733 foreign agents in the list. It includes excluded agents. Why I decided to provide you this specific number? Because I wanted to illustrate that even if you're excluded from the list for certain reason, you're still remain in it. So all the risks that are connected to just having this toxic title that are maybe not legal but reputational, they will remain. So 733 right now, and 124 undesirable organizations. And all people who participated somehow in these organizations can be prosecuted. Even recently there was a case when just having books from these organizations was considered a potential violation. Now, why I mentioned all these articles? Because all of them hold a very specific risk for repeated violations. You can be criminally prosecuted. So just administrative discreditation can transform into criminal discreditation up to 5 years in prison. Participation in foreign organizations up to 3 years. And the administrative I'm sorry, I've messed up the number. So you can see that the first one is violation of foreign agents rules, and it can lead up to 5 years in prison. 20.3.3 discreditation can lead up to 7 years. And also you can see all the other articles under the umbrella of foreign agents and undesirables, up to 6 years, and up to 2 years for repeated violations of assembly rules. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Now we will turn to extrajudicial persecutions, and I think it would be Elizabeth again who will present it to us, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Thank you. So I think we can move to the next slide. So what we define as an extrajudicial persecution is an extra legal method of state pressure on people, especially non-activists and the families. These methods are used both as tool of additional pressure on people and simply within the framework of permissiveness of law enforcement agencies. So this has occurred before the start of the full-scale invasion, and this has only continued to grow since then. I think we can move to the next slide. So here are the stats of the cases we have recorded. I will talk about a bit more about recording such cases later. So such things include like situations like event cancellation, for example, meetings, concerts of musicians who spoke out against the war, exhibitions of painters who spoke out against the war. So this kind of situations which is used also as a part of economic pressure on people. Property damage, such as attacks on on vehicles of activists, on the places of their residence, etc. Assaults, harassment at work, threats, expulsion from universities, exclusion from organizations, deprivation of status, deprivation of property. So these things that pressure people into speaking out through economic pressure, through pressure on the families, through creating a dead zone around them, and therefore either makes them a pariah or forces them to go in silent. I think we can go to the next slide. So extrajudicial persecutions are used as a method of intimidation. For example, when pro-government channels post a video of a person apologizing on the cameras, we have a huge practice of such forced apologies where people are being threatened or physically beaten into making such videos. This is a signal to, this can work as a signal to everyone else to keep their heads down. This is also a far easier method of persecution, because opening a case, administrative or especially criminal in Russian bureaucracy, is more difficult than using such extra legal methods. Method of preventive censorship. It's, for example, easier for director of school, university, theater, any kind of public organization to fire dissident than to deal with the consequences in the form of disconsent from the state, if the state finds out that such dissident works there. It's also used as a pressure method. It's one thing to be fined. It's another thing to lose your job. Know that it's going to be harder for you to get a job later. So this is a very serious method of economic pressure. I think we can go to the next slide. So when we estimate the amount of cases that we encounter, it's important to note that we see more and more people in such situations who are not activists in classical sense. So these are people who just voice their opinions in front of colleagues, in front of other acquaintances. Most people who have been subjected to such pressure are not very likely to reveal it to anyone. They may consult with human rights organization, but they do not want it to go very public, because especially if you're talking about threats of losing a job, people are not interested in this situation, for example, being Googled. And we are also collecting information from public sources, but it's a very small part of what we believe is happening. Yet this information can be used to analyze the scale of pressure put on by the government and by state-affiliated actors and authorities, the kind of pressure that are being put on people who express dissident views and participate in activism. I think that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to conclude this section, I would tell that we almost did not touch really the topic of foreign agents and undesirable organizations, which represent a very important layer of repression against civil society in modern Russia. We did not talk much about that because that would be exactly the topic of our next seminar, which will take place on 19th of January. Please do come. And the other important thing to mention is that OVD-Info just published a report with overview of politically motivated persecutions, enforcement practices and developments in repressive legislations with a lot of data. And you have a link to this report in the email you received probably today with the link to this online meeting. It was published in Russian, but we will translate it very soon. So I also invite you to read it. Our next speaker is my colleague Dania Britton, who will explain to us what has changed in terms of collecting the information on repression since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Please, floor is yours.
Hi, and thank you. Yeah, my name is Dania, and I work in OVD-Info, well, not as a researcher, but as a coordinator of a group called Group of Monitoring. Well, basically, it's a 24/7 department which works with two things. First, we work as a hotline for all the questions and requests for help related to political repressions in Russia. And second, we write news about these repressions. And well, we write and publish this news in different formats, which you can all see on the screen, and there are links. And in addition, we also publish them every day and every month in form of digests touching these issues. Yeah, probably next slide. Thanks. As far as I understand, we talked a little bit before in the previous seminars about how we work with the information coming directly to our hotline. However, there is a lot of information which we take from and gather from like other public sources, such as media outlets, for example, or regional activist communities. And both ways of how we work with this information changed dramatically in the last 2 years. Well, because of the war and what is happening in Russia. I think I'm going to start with like a small story. In December 2021, I gathered and organized all the channels in social networks which were somehow related to the team of famous Russian politician, Alexei Navalny. They were all like separate regional channels in different regions. And there were about 40 or 50 of them. And I was very proud of myself that I collected and organized all these channels, because it meant we would collect more information from regional communities. However, in 2 months after this, we couldn't use them anymore because all of those channels and communities are now closed. First, well, because of the war, and second, because all the structures related to Alexei Navalny have been considered parts of extremist organization since then. So the most evident effect of the last 2 years of our work is the reduction of sources and media from where we would gather the information. The government uses several tactics to target this, specifically the sources of information. For example, by declaring them foreign agent, undesirable organizations. And it's worth mentioning that it is not only famous and big medias which are being targeted, but it is also small and local papers or media outlets or even just activist movements. What is also important to mention is that the government doesn't only target the media institutions themselves, but also the individual journalists and editorial boards, and actually does it in like all possible ways, including criminal charges and other actions. Like, for example, you can see on the slide, there is first journalist, Ivan Safronov, who is a war journalist, and he was charged with treason, and now he was sentenced last year to 22 years in prison. Below him, there is a journalist called Elena Kostychenko, who was last year poisoned, and these are just 2 famous cases. There are much more. I personally believe that the goal of such targeting is creating a sense of fear and forcing independent sources of information into closing, which is happening. Lots of media outlets have closed in Russia in the last 2 years. Next slide, please. What else these threats and fear create is that the many journalists, activists, and other actors are massively, like in massive scale, leaving the country. Many journalists who worked with independent media outlets are now in emigration, which means less and less sources on the ground. There are less journalists who can broadcast what is happening in courts, in police stations, on the streets, at homes of those who are politically persecuted, etc. Less source on the ground means the more in the dark we are. Probably next slide. Yeah, thanks. And all of these problems are intensified by the fact that governmental institutions such as courts or investigators do not cooperate with the journalists. They haven't really done it before, but now they just don't do it anymore at all. It is significantly important that most of the independent journalists are considered by these institutions to be an enemy, which means that verification of information is much more complicated, and it also takes now a lot more resources and time to actually first find sources, verify them, and unravel the information. Next slide. More problems to come. Because of all the reasons mentioned above, the coverage of the legal cases depends much more now on the lawyers of those being politically prosecuted. First of all, which is also a problem, because first of all, not all lawyers or human rights organizations work, for example, on borderline cases, which my colleague talked about. Such cases include arson, sabotage, etc. And if such people do not have lawyers, like independent lawyers, the only source of information is the law enforcers. And well, the information coming from the law enforcement cannot be trusted. You can see the example on the slide. An anti-war war activist recently died while being in a detention center after protesting the war. And it is believed that his death could have been caused by torture. However, law enforcement does not show any evidence and says that it was a suicide. And this is kind of cases we have to work with as journalists now. Next slide, please. Yeah, and finally, all these problems lead to the main one, I think. Less and less public information on the cases of political repressions in Russia. First of all, persecuted people themselves do not want a lot of publicity. Second, sometimes they just refuse to publish any information on their case, or fears and ask them to remove these publications. And and for some charges, for example, in treason cases, the defense lawyers can also think that it is important not to talk publicly about these cases, which makes it impossible to understand the scale of all the persecution. Like, for example, today there was an article made by Mediazona in which the journalists were parsing data from courts, and they realized that in last year there were more than 100 cases of charges for state treason. And in our data right now, we only have like 14 cases of treason which we know about and consider to be political persecution, because we do not know enough about these cases to actually consider them to be like political repression or not, because we just do not know enough information about them. Next slide, please. And how we work with all of this? Well, first of all, we try to focus our work right now on automations and like parsing of the data from governmental sources. Like, for example, we have an instrument which was talked about before, I believe, called SudMonster. It is an instrument parsing data and information from Russian courts. And also we have right now an instrument which is parsing data from regional law enforcement websites. And we are trying to work on new ideas on how to collect data from like different sources of governmental institutions, which we would be able to believe. I think that would be all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I would like to call back Lisa in order to give us a little bit of information about our monthly digest.
Okay, thank you. So we have two types of monthly products that summarize all the stats we have on the verified cases. The first one is more general. It's the repression report, which presents like a monthly digest of events separated in several categories with a breakdown of selected topics like pressure on lawyers, on academics, deportation, pressure in detention centers, so on and so on. Also, all the updates in several major sectors, such as anti-war protests, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of association, other cases that do not fall in this kind of categories. So it's like a breakdown on all that has been important this month and only particular events that have been important this month, and the stats on the criminal, administrative, and extralegal persecution. But this one is more general, and the second one is on the next slide. Yeah, persecution of an anti-war movement report. So this one is far more focused on the anti-war repression, because in the previous one it's it's a bit shorter. So here we have a very focused and very thorough analysis of everything that is going on with the anti-war movement. This includes the new types of criminal persecution of the anti-war movement, news on how government tries to counter information that does not suit its narrative. It's a short summary on detentions, criminal cases, extrajudicial persecution, pressure on media censorship, pressure on human rights defenders, new repressive laws, etc., etc. We have started doing this digest because there was a lot of questions both within our organization and outside of it, like from journalists and international organizations, about the state of the anti-war movement in the first month of the full-scale invasion. So it's sort of it's a digest that helps us to keep people updated on the types of protests that of how the protest is evolving, how repression on it is evolving. It also features statistics, prominent cases, etc., etc. So, yeah, I think that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give a floor to my colleague Dan Storiev, who would tell about our media outreach. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me right?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Right, so I'll just talk a little bit about our media outreach, and yeah, you have this on the slide. So I highly recommend all of y'all to, after the presentation, to follow the links on this slide. There's a lot of interesting information here. And right, well, anyway, thank you for being here. Basically, in order for us to ensure that we are understood in the West, that we're heard in the West in one form or another, we need to develop our own unique voice in English. We need to develop our own unique voice, talking to institutions, donors, scholars, journalists, etc. in the West, mainly, I mean, Europe, UK, and the United States. And there are numerous ways of how we can do this. This is done through original content, and this would be our newsletter called the Distant Digest, which I suggest all of y'all to follow. It comes out once a week on every Thursday of every week, every Tuesday of every week, and it outlines the general trends of repressions and of the struggle against repressions in Russia. And we don't just pick, you know, a bunch of headlines and sort of throw them at you. We make sure to explain what is behind the repressive trends and how there's a resistance to these trends actually works. We also have our amazing tool called Letters Across Borders. I highly recommend you checking this out. It allows you to write a letter to any Russian political prisoner and in any language you want. Now, in Russia, you can't send letters to prison in any other language but English, but Russian, sorry. And this allows you to, so you write a letter, we translate it, and we send it free of charge, and we make sure that your correspondence is maintained. Letters Across Borders. We also have a lot of translated content. So we translate our data reports, we translate articles that first come out in Russian, and then after a few days, we put them up on our English language website and our social media. We also have plenty of joint projects. This is something that's really important for us. We try to place a lot of op-eds, Moscow Times, Financial Times, Riddle, Medusa. We have our fledgling internship program, if any of y'all students might be interested. And of course, we also engage in plenty of networking. So we got seminars and conferences like this amazing seminar that I'm speaking at right now. I will sum up, and Daniel, please let me know if I'm running out of time. So just say it. We are very much in need of a better and a more humane understanding of Russian civil society in the West, because in order for us to continue operate from abroad, to continue impacting the lives of ordinary Russians and helping Russians who stand up against the war, it is necessary for us to be understood and welcomed by Western institutions. And that's why it's so important for us that our content, our original voice in English is well heard, that it is shared, that it is listened to. And so I urge all of y'all to, subscribe to all of the content that I've just listed, subscribe to this in Digest, use Letters Across Borders, and subscribe to our social media, of course. And please tell about it to your friends and to your coworkers, your colleagues, because all of you are, I'm assuming, amazing Russia specialists, but we need to be heard beyond just Russia-focused, human rights-focused academia. We need to be heard in the Office of Power and in grassroots civil society meetings, etc. So yeah.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And just to conclude this, in email you received today, there are links to all of these products. So now let's switch to the other topic. We know a lot about the details of persecution, not only because we collect this information, but also because we ourselves are protecting some of these people. And this part of our work also changed after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And I would like to give now the floor to my colleague, Elena Lipatova, who will tell us exactly about that. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, but maybe if you could talk a little bit louder, it would be better.
A little bit louder. Okay.
Yes, great.
And now, can you hear me? Okay,
yes,
okay.
yes.
I'm going to be very, very loud. I will start my presentation with the question, is Russian judiciary effective? And right now I will give you an answer. No, Russian judiciary is not effective, despite the fact that there is a small chance to dismiss the case. This year, OVD-Info lawyers worked in 1,509 cases on administrative offenses, and just 105 cases were dismissed. Mostly cases are dismissed because of police and judicial mistakes or some procedural violations. I will name just some examples, but there are much more. For example, it can be a repeated prosecution for the same offense, or it can be an improper notification of a court hearing, or it can be an expiry of a time limit for liability. Next slide, please. So why do we think that judiciary is ineffective? We conducted a few studies on cassation courts and the Supreme Court's practice on anti-war expression and freedom of assembly. I need to note that a study on freedom of assembly covers a period from 2019 to 2022, so partly before the invasion. And the results are very, very disappointing. In rare cases, courts found the prosecuted not guilty, and they dismissed cases. However, in these cases, prosecuted did not participate in a public event, or authorization of an event was not required by law. And only once a court agreed that participation in an authorized peaceful assembly does not itself constitute an offense, and that the legality of police action shall be assessed. But this is only one case, and we think this is an exception to the rule, so it's not the rule. And lastly, we could not find a single case where a court agreed that anti-war statements are legitimate. So for these reasons, we think that an existing chance for dismissal does not make the system effective. And the next slide, please. What about criminal cases? The situation is quite the same. Cases, of course, are dismissed, but you could see from the slide that only once the reason for the dismissal was the absence of corpus delicti, meaning that the defendant was innocent. Next slide, please. So yeah, being a lawyer, of course, in politically motivated cases, of course, a very difficult task for many reasons. They can be prosecuted or face extrajudicial pressure, and we know many cases they can be deprived of their attorney status. They may face restrictions on the openness and publicity in their cases. And yeah, of course, they experience fears, anxiety, burnout, and etc. Next slide, please. But we still provide legal assistance, and there are some reasons for that. First of all, we're trying to obtain an acquittal, if it's possible, or at least we're trying to dismiss the case. And I said that there is a difference between acquittal, yes, and dismissals. Secondly, our efforts may result, of course, in the reduction of punishment or preventive measure. Thirdly, we are still exhausting domestic remedies for international courts. After the expulsion of Russia from the Council of Europe, many lawyers and applicants as well, they turned to alternative institutions, and one of them is the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Yes, another reason is that legal aid is seen as psychological help by many defendants, for sure. Then we document violations and publicize them. It's very important. And last but not least, we put bureaucratic pressure and restrain the repressive system. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. Not only we are working defending particular persecuted people, but we are also trying to document repression and obtain legal opinions on international level. So I would like now to give floor to my colleague Violetta Fitzner, who will tell us about this in more details, please.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. Can you hear me?
We can hardly hear you. Can you?
Okay, I can try to speak louder. Is it better?
Yes, it's
Okay.
better.
So in OVD-Info, we have a team that focuses on strategic litigation. And what we do is that we work with cases with systemic problems, the solution of which can potentially lead to significant changes in legislation or practice in Russia. And when we do our strategic litigation, we always rely on our data. So we include our data on the political persecutions or human rights violations in the text of our applications or complaints to national and international institutions. And also, our strategic litigation work is also very connected to our advocacy work. So, for example, when we prepare an advocacy report, we also include the information about our strategic litigation cases. Next slide, please. Daniel, can you switch to the next slide? Thank you. So let's talk about what we did last 2 years. First of all, we had a huge campaign before the Russian Constitutional Court. we were trying to challenge the administrative provision on discrediting the use of Russian armed forces, which is used by the authorities to suppress any anti-war expression in Russia. So we argued that this law violates the Russian constitution. And we had a huge media coverage, and there were 4 amicus briefs submitted by the international experts, but still, unfortunately, the Russian Constitutional Court rejected our claim. Moreover, there was a case just recently before the Supreme Court of Russia on the recognition of LGBT movement as extremist, and OVD-Info signed a joint amicus brief from the Russian civil society in relation to this case, where we protested such a recognition. But again, unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Russia still recognized the LGBT movement as extremist in Russia. Can you switch to the next slide? So, and as you can see, our strategic litigation inside of Russia is not very successful, because as my colleague Elena just mentioned, that judicial system in Russia is not effective at all. And therefore, we focus mostly now on the international institutions. So we continue to send some applications to the European Court of Human Rights. But of course, after the expulsion of Russia from the Council of Europe, we turned to the UN mechanisms and started to use them more often. So, for example, in the last 2 years, we submitted several applications to the working group on arbitrary detention on the anti-war cases. We also sent individual applications to the UN Human Rights Committee and individual submissions to the special procedures and in particular special rapporteurs. Next slide, please. So now the main question is, why are we doing that? First of all, we think that it's necessary to try every available human rights mechanism to protect human rights in Russia, even if some of these mechanisms are not very effective. Moreover, it is a way to document these internal repressions and human rights violations that we have in Russia. And it is a way to inform the international community about the human rights situation. And actually not the international community only, because we also try to inform people in Russia which do not always have unrestricted access to the information about repressions and violations. In addition, this strategic litigation work helps to legitimize our work and data, because it's just one thing when we provide this information, and it's another thing when the international institution use this data, use this expertise in the text of their own decisions and judgments on our cases. Moreover, this strategic litigation work provides us an opportunity to obtain expert legal opinion on the particular legislation or particular practice in Russia, as well as recommendations for the Russian authorities, which the Russian civil society can use also for the future changes in Russia. And finally, when it comes to the anti-war cases, such strategic litigation can also be a part of the anti-war movement, as it was when we were trying to challenge this law before the Russian Constitutional Court. Next slide, please. And finally, when we do our strategic litigation, we always try to collaborate with other civil society organizations. As you can see from my slide, in the last 2 years, we collaborated with many human rights projects and experts in and outside of Russia. And we do it because we try to represent the broader opinion of the civil society. And we think that this such joint action, brings actually a more impactful result. And it helps to improve our ties with civil society inside and outside of Russia. And as a conclusion, I just would like to mention that in our website, which you know, of course, we also have a special page on the strategic litigation where you can find more information if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to conclude the presentation, I would like to give a word to Professor Lauren McCarthy, who kindly agreed to tell a few words about how she is using OVD-Info data in the research. Please, floor is yours, and I would stop the presentation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So I think everybody at OVD-Info has done a really amazing job at sharing all of the things that they have, but I wanted to take a couple minutes and just talk a little bit about how I've used this data. So my current project is writing a book on the implementation of the packet of repressive laws that were passed on March 4th, 2022, which effectively forbid all forms of anti-war expression. And we've talked about a lot of these today. In particular, I'm interested in the administrative offense of discrediting the military and the criminal offenses that are kind of companion offenses of disseminating knowingly false information about the military and repeat discrediting. And I will say that without OVD-Info's data and help, there is no way I would have even attempted this project. And so I want to be a little bit more specific about how this has unfolded for me. My own scholarly interests have lay in the implementation of new laws by legal bureaucracies in Russia for a long time. And so when these laws were passed, I immediately wondered what the rollout was going to look like. Would it be totally chaotic with each region doing something different, or would the political nature of these charges make people snap to a lot more quickly? And I soon realized that going from court website to court website to court website to search for all of the charges on 20.3.3 was going to take decades, possibly. And so I reached out to OVD-Info, where I had been volunteering for several months at that point already, and asked if they knew where I could find the court decisions. And lo and behold, they said, we have them. And so this is thanks to the effort of a tremendous number of volunteers, their data team, and in cooperation with MediaZona. And so I started working with this data. My co-authors and I engaged in text-as data analysis to provide us with a lot of quantitative data from these judicial decisions. And we did a lot of qualitative examination of the decisions themselves. And so earlier this year, we managed to publish a paper on the first 4 months of implementation of the discrediting laws, which I will drop a link to. It's open access. I'll put that in the chat when I finish talking. The book project extends that analysis to add the criminal laws and trying to examine the anatomy of the repressive system from the inside out. And as you can see from the presentations today, OVD-Info has just collected huge amounts of data. And when I wrote my first book about the implementation of human trafficking laws, I had to collect that data myself. And now I can just go to OVD-Info and I can download the data and I can use it and update it as necessary. But more important than even the data, it's, I think, a really strong commitment that I have seen by everyone at OVD-Info to make that data useful and to working with researchers to help them get what they need. And there are so many people on this call that I've worked with to do those pieces of work. And I think the seminar series makes that commitment really clear. But also for those of us who were used to doing fieldwork on the ground, and who are no longer going to be able to go to Russia to do that, I think having these kinds of connections with OVD-Info, who still have many people in the country, can mean that you can ask a lot of questions that are helpful for more general knowledge about what's going on. Have you seen this type of prosecution? Have you heard of this kind of thing happening? And so that's been also a really important part of the relationship that I've built with the data team at OVD-Info and various other folks in the organization. And so I'm going to stop there, but I just hope that this has given you a little bit of an idea of how one can work with this data from an academic perspective. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I think we're turning now, Danielle, to the Q&A. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this speech. And I give the word back to Anne Le Huérou.
Yes, so thank you very much, Sharon. And I totally agree and imagine how we already understand, all of us, how it's valuable to possibly work with OVD-Info data.